Tonight, we are going to hear from Stephanie Broadnax Broussard, a licensed clinical social worker who is going to provide us with some tips and strategies on how to maintain or create healthy, supportive relationships. We are then going to be joined by 3 women who are also going to share how their breast cancer diagnosis has affected relationships in their lives. We would love to hear from all of you as well, so be sure to share with us in the chat and ask questions in the Q&A session. Stephanie Broadnax Broussard is a licensed clinical social worker, an advanced certified hospice and palliative care social worker, and the director of palliative care and social work at Texas Oncology. You can read more about Stephanie on lbbc.org. Welcome, Stephanie.
Thank you so much, Tia. I'm so glad to be here amongst you all. I'm just so excited that LBBC is offering this opportunity and all the great partners. I think this is just so dynamic that we're able to come into this collective space and really have a really honest conversation about navigating relationships. So I hope that this is informative. I think you guys know more than I do about navigating this experience. What I hope to do is share some information that I've learned walking alongside those experiencing and living with cancer and in survivorship. And so I'm just really honored to be here. So I am going to dive in, and I am one of those people who actually love to see the chat moving. So, and I'm also a Southern girl. I grew up the granddaughter of a Baptist preacher, so I love a good amen corner. So if there's something that I'm saying that feels and resonates with you, I'd love to see that in the chat. Maybe there's something I'm saying that you're like, not so much, girl, that's not it. I'd also love to see that too. I want this to be as fluid as we can and try to have a conversation as well. So I'm gonna dive in and hopefully I can share my screen. Okay, so we are family, we're navigating relationships. And so what I want to do is kind of set the tone for our conversation today, a little bit of our agenda. We're going to talk about how cancer affects family life in intimate relationships. And we're going to just dive in and explore all the dynamics of those relationships. So I love a good quote. And so we're going to start out with, when someone has cancer, the whole family and everyone who loves them does too. And I think one of the things that resonates with me with this quote is that as I support individuals and families, one of the things I see is that oftentimes we don't know what to do to serve those around us who are navigating cancer. So we're going to talk about the perspective from relationships as the person living with cancer, but then also from the perspective about those people who are around. And so maybe there are some here who are trying to support those with cancer as well. So we hope to hit it on both ends and just have a really good conversation. All right, so how does cancer affect the family? So the reality is that it's a myriad of ways, and I'm not going to be able to hit every one of them today. So I want to be really honest about that, okay? So, and I want to highlight something really quickly. As I said, I'm kind of here in the, I'll look in the chat and I'm just going to go through the conversation. One of the things I think that's really important when we talk about relationships is that the individual with cancer is the person that is living and navigating the disease. They are the person that cancer is happening to. They are the primary focus. The reality, though, is also, in addition to that, the people who love them are walking alongside them in that experience. And so that experience does impact the systems that they're a part of. So whether that's their families, whether that's their intimate relationships, whether that is their friendships, because we all play roles and have responsibilities in the systems that we're a part of. So when we think about how cancer can affect our relationships in our family life, there is our emotional needs. There's the changing in our physical abilities or needs, the changing relationship and roles, the change of our responsibilities, competing priorities, changing future plans. And so we'll talk a little bit about grief and loss, but then also just exacerbating existing dynamics. And so a lot of times when we think about relationships, one of the things that we know to be true is if we add any kind of trauma or crisis, those experiences the dynamics that already exist are exacerbated. So they are increased, they're challenged, they're stretched. And so our relationships are also part of that. So just as the individual is navigating all this and their emotions, all the individual needs change and how they relate and see the world, sometimes their perspective is shifted. Those relationships around us also are feeling that same impact. So we're going to try to separate the different areas and kind of talk a little bit about some of the changes specifically. So when we think about the changing of roles, one of the things that I hear all the time is about like the superwoman. And when we think about Black women specifically, I feel like as a population, we've kind of been forced to wear it all. We have to wear the cape, where we're kind of wearing all the weight of our family. So we're trying to be a caregiver and a caretaker. We're trying to shoulder the responsibility, whether it's a person that's a single parent or all of our other roles. And so oftentimes when navigating cancer, there's a change in the role because the culture shifts. And so every single slide that I share today, you will hear that their communication is key. I think part of what I see when supporting families is that oftentimes we're trying to hold things so that we don't shift our emotional needs or physical needs onto someone else. Part of that is because we feel like sometimes people can't handle it. They can't shoulder the weight of it all. But then oftentimes it looks like we don't know how to release and relinquish and find the safety and security because maybe someone hasn't shown up in that way for us before. So we don't know that we can trust that people can handle the things that we carry. And so the idea that superwoman, that we have to be superwoman is a myth, right? We're humans having human experiences. And so I like to, anytime I can, challenge that notion that we have to be a superwoman. Right? We can't. The reality is that we're humans with emotions and feelings. And so if we don't give up the cape, then we not only do harm to ourselves, but the people around us as well, because we can't do it all. And so sometimes crisis will push us into a space where we have to figure out how to navigate differently. And so one of the things that I want to talk about is the shift from caregiver to care recipient. Oftentimes, as the person who usually is primary caregiver in a lot of our families, what can happen is that now there's a need that we have where someone has to provide care for us or has to support us. And so what do you do when there's that shift? And so if we don't properly communicate or set up the dynamics so where people know how to serve us, then we can sometimes have people in the places we don't want them. Sometimes people will insert themselves in the spaces that they think are the most helpful, but really may not be what we need. And so I'm going to talk a little bit later about like, what does it look like for people to operate in our love languages? But when that shift happens from caregiver to care recipient, without adequate conversation and communication, we may create gaps in our own care needs because we don't know how to tell people how to serve us, how to show up for us. And sometimes in these situations, I've worked with people and they don't really know what they need, right? They just know that there's something, I can't do it all, but I don't know what to ask for. And so when that shift happens from caregiver to care recipient, it can often shake the dynamics of a family. Think about, you went from being the mom who prepared all the meals and washed the clothes and took the kids, everywhere that they needed to go, to now having some fatigue or challenges that impacts your ability to do some of those things. If we don't communicate, it can create gaps. And so we're going to talk a little bit about how do you do that when those changes happen in the roles? How do we communicate to make sure those things don't happen? Another thing, and I don't want to pick on y'all, I don't want y'all to feel like I'm bullying today, but another thing is about accepting help. I don't know anyone outside of Black women who is so resistant to accepting help at times. And so I want to challenge the notion that that we can't accept help. We may not know what the help is, and people may not do the things that we do them as well as we do them or how we would do them, but doesn't mean that they can't do them. And so it also means that we have to kind of sometimes just sit back and accept that help. And I think it can be difficult when navigating something that's so outside of your control, right? With cancer, there isn't a lot of control that we have in regards to what the disease is doing. And so part of what I want to do is hopefully to empower you guys today to see those spaces where there's opportunity for control in your relationships, to really kind of dive in. And so someone mentioned, I saw in the chat, relationship, whether it's your family, your significant other, your care team, there is power in that control and leaning in. And so sometimes that means speaking up and saying, you know what, there's this thing I need. I'm not sure how to get it done. Can you help me? Or I'm not sure what I need. I just know I can't do it all. Also, the changing of roles can look like redefining roles. So does that mean that you are no longer the primary caregiver in your home? Is there someone else who can take on those things? Or maybe does that mean that if you're the person who always maybe cooks, does that mean you can shift some of those responsibilities to be now the meal prepper or planner and someone else prepare the meals? sometimes we're so tied to our roles as mom or wife or daughter or sister or champion or leader or whatever roles we assume on the million things that we do, that we identify what we serve as who we are. And I want to challenge you guys to think sometimes that can create different layers and complex grief, because those roles are really important. They're really valuable, but they're not who you are. And so sometimes we'll hold on to those roles so tightly as we navigate the cancer experience, and it really creates a dynamic in our family that can be difficult for those around us to try to navigate. And so not only do we have resentment because we have needs going unmet, we're disappointed and frustrated because why aren't you showing up for us in the way that you should? But then they don't know because the roles have shifted and no one told them. So that's why it's really important to also communicate feelings about changes. Sometimes changes are happening, and we talked a little bit about control. And so I don't want all the changes to be happening to you. I think there are some things that we can communicate and say, you know what, when you decided to help me with this, that didn't feel good. Or it felt like you were making this decision for me and I want us to make decisions together. So let's talk about what these things look like. Or this is still my house. These are still my children. Or mom, dad, I know how to still, I'm an adult. I need your support, but here's how I'd like to receive that. And so when the changes are happening, don't feel like you're gonna alienate yourself or reject the help or alienate the people who are trying to serve you because you speak up for yourself. I think sometimes when we have help that's coming, we feel like in order to receive it and be grateful, that means we have to take it as it comes. And I don't think that's the case. I think there are opportunities to communicate in a really healthy way and communicate your needs, but also the desires and where you need that support, and get that. But that also means you have to share the desires. So for example, if there's spaces that you need help and you've communicated about the changes and the feelings, you want to make sure that you're sharing what you hope to see, what you would like to have happen, or what you would like to experience within the context of your family and your roles. And so we can sometimes almost talk ourselves out of circumstances because we have a vision. I think we talk a lot about expectations, right? And I think social media and society has created this picture of what things look like and all those kind of things. But the reality is that it's okay for us to have desires, but if we don't share what those are, people can't meet them. And so it's like it's setting them up for failure automatically. And so then we're disappointed because we haven't told them, right? We haven't shared those things. And then the last thing is remain inflexible, right? I know that people talk about a lot about just kind of taking things as they come and, you know, rolling with the punches. And it's important to kind of see things as they are. But also it's important to be flexible, not necessarily about what's important to you, but how people show up for you. People can't love us outside their capacity. So that's the first thing, being open to where and how they show up. But also, if people can't serve you and love you the way that you need, being okay with boundaries too. I think sometimes we feel like we can't do both. Two things can be true. We can be grateful and extremely grateful for the support and love that people are showing us, but also know that something doesn't fit well with your boundaries and expectations, and being okay with communicating that. And most importantly, if you didn't hear anything from this section, get rid of your cape. The capes do not exist. You may have superpowers, but you are not a superwoman, right? You may give the illusion and appearance that you're a superhero because of how you carry all that you carry, but you're a human and you deserve the love, compassion, and support as you navigate your human experience. So we talked about how the roles change, but what about the responsibilities? Because the two are so interconnected. And as I mentioned, communication is key. So just because cancer happened doesn't mean life around you or all the things that you're responsible for stops. And so what do you do? And the first thing I would really encourage you to do is, number one, communicate with the people in your support system. But the second thing is relinquish control. And I you know, you're like, Stephanie, you just said, like, tap in, get in control what you can. But when I talk about relinquishing control in regards to responsibilities, I'm really mean about like that your way is the only way, right? That the way you cook that baked chicken with the seasoning and then the you know, all that first is the only way these children are going to get fed, or that they have to have these vegetables, or the way you organize, or the way you fold the clothes, or all those things. Just because it's your way doesn't mean it's the only way. So when I say relinquish control, I mean that, yes, have your expectations, yes, have your boundaries, but some of the things that we're in spaces where we're going to have to shift some of those responsibilities, be okay with it being done and not just how you see it. And then also, when we think about shifting responsibilities, be willing to teach. Sometimes it looks like we have to do all those things and there's no one else to do the things that we need to have done. But maybe there's an opportunity for you to teach people how to serve you. Teach people also how to serve and do some of the things that you do. For example, if you're the person that's the person that cooks, once again, in your family, teach them, maybe pull up a chair. If you can't stand long, pull up a chair and walk them through it. Or do some organization as far as meal prep and talking through what that looks like, or helping to make a list. Let people serve in a way that's possible for them, but also within your abilities. And be willing to shuffle the deck. So one of the things and responsibilities is, and as I mentioned about roles, is that we are so tied to what they bring to our family. There is no other you. What you do matters. And so, especially in navigating cancer, one of the things I've heard from my patients over and over again is that, I don't want my family to get used to me not doing this. I think it's important that I do this. I don't know how long I'll be able to do it. So I want to make sure that I do it and I do it this way and that they know this happens. But the reality is that we could shuffle the deck a little bit sometimes with those roles and still maintain the love and joy that's provided in some of those things that we do. So that may look like enlisting a service to come and wash the cars, or using a laundry system. It may look like letting your husband cook if he's not a good cook. It may look like shuffling the deck and teaching your kids some new skills and letting them tap in just a little bit more. It may look like letting someone else help the kids with homework. It may look like shuffling the deck in those roles and responsibilities that are really important to you, but remembering that just because you change your role doesn't mean it eliminates the relationship. So sometimes we think that because it is so significant that if I shift some of my responsibility, then it also means that I am shifting and trying to remove myself from the dynamics of the relationship or how important it is. And that's just not true. And so we have to challenge those negative narratives that kind of surface out of fear or concern, where it's like, well, if I don't do this, then will they know I love them? Because so much of what we do is an act of love as women, right? How we serve our family is an act of love. How we prepare those meals is an act of love. And even the smallest things, whether it's laundry or doing hair or whatever, all of it's an act of love. And so sometimes we can think that if we stop those things or shift the deck, then does that mean that they don't feel the love from me? And so I'm here to kind of just throw that to hell in a handbasket, really, to say the reality is that no matter what you do with your roles, no matter what you do to shift the responsibilities, it does not negate the value that you bring to your family and your relationships. Okay? And then also be willing to learn to navigate limitations. Sometimes because we have to be so strong, we don't want to say that we have some weaknesses or that we're having some limitations or we're having some challenges. And so that communication about saying where those things are and being willing to speak up can sometimes really help us and help those around us know how to better serve. And one of the things I like to talk about just in this area when we talk about responsibilities, because sometimes there aren't places to shift, right? Sometimes if you are holding all the load and there isn't a place to put it down, there isn't a deck, it could feel like, well, what do I do now? And that's where I want to encourage leaning in and really looking in your health provider about where support networks, leaning into communities like LBBC and all the great partners here today, because sometimes that means you have to create a community if it doesn't already exist for you. Okay. So, and what about the changes in emotional needs? And so this is where I'm going to talk real tough, y'all. I'm gonna go start to walk a little heavy, because I think part of us as a community, and I'm going to speak as a Black woman, I think part of what happens is our community is that when we think about who we are as superwomen in just generational historical context, there hasn't been a lot of room for our emotions, right? So the reality is that when navigating cancer, emotional needs vary and they change often, not just yours, but also the people in your system. And so sometimes if we navigate emotions and circumstances how we've always done them, then it doesn't work. right? People perceive us differently. They think we don't care as much, or they think we care too much, we're overinvested. So one of the things we need to do is make sure that we communicate those changes, but also make sure that we hone in and look in and be introspective. Sometimes our emotions are all over the place, and so we're not sure what we feel. We're not sure we can't give it a name. But it's really important that we kind of try to make sure that we're tapping into whether it's support systems, a therapist, a counselor, a social worker, someone to really help us figure that out if we're having some trouble, okay? Lean in support groups, really have somebody that you could talk to say, hey, I'm feeling like kind of up and down or having these changes. Help me process that, okay? Depression, anxiety, hopelessness, fear, and anger are valid, and they are real and they are normal. I actually just spoke to a woman earlier this week, and she was telling me how everybody's acting like because she's just entered in survivorship, that magically everything changes, and that no one in her world has been able to kind of relate to the fact that, yes, she's grateful, but like she didn't get swept up with the sea of relief. And so the people in her life are just difficult to be around because they're all expecting everything to just magically change. And so one of the things that I want to say is that all the feelings are valid and they all have a place. And, we talk a lot about hope and about pursuit of I get kind of upset with some of the lingo that's used in regards to cancer and the cancer journey and experience and fighting and those kind of things. But I think regardless of what lingo you choose to describe it, the reality is that even though all the feelings are valid, some of them it's not a safe place to rest our hat in. And so what do we do to make sure that we have the support we need to be able to go the distance and navigate, okay? And so if we're struggling with depression and anxiety or even hopelessness, it's important that we get some help, right? When we are Black women, we don't want to tell anybody that we're sad, especially when we add the elements of like faith and belief and all this, and we have to show up for our family. We feel like we have to walk around with a smile and it's all well. And sometimes it's not. Sometimes it sucks and it's trash. And so we have to be able to look at it and say, okay, here I am today. These are my feelings. How do I get support from that? And we have to be aware and not resistant to medication intervention if we need it, okay? And also we can't neglect our own feelings for the sake of everyone else in our system. They have a place and they're really important. And if we don't neglect them, they'll show up in other ways. It's also important to acknowledge that when we're in a family system, that everybody's not going to arrive to the same emotional place at the same time. So whereas you may be processing and at a place where you've reached a resolve with some of the things about your experience, doesn't mean your partner will at the same time, or vice versa, or your children or your parents. And so it's also important, just as much as they are there for you and they have to be respectful of where you are in your emotional space, I would really encourage individuals to think about, how do I see them, and not try to carry the weight of their emotions or where they are, but acknowledge that there is space for their emotions. And if you don't have space, make sure they can get to somebody else who can help hold that space for them as well. And then the reality is that sometimes you can't name the emotion. You feel all this stuff and you can't put a name to it. And so sometimes what comes up because it's easy is anger, or that frustration, or just irritability, because those are easy emotions that come up to the surface really easy. But when we're having communication and we're trying to really navigate our relationships, it's important to name the emotion so that people can better understand us. And sometimes we just can't. So I like to go back to that old school feeling wheel. And I know it's really elementary. It's a children's tool, but you can always Google a feelings wheel. And sometimes I'll tell people to start with what you know. So if you're feeling angry, start at angry and walk your way into all the different emotions that are really there. So sometimes what's on the surface is anger, but really what it is that I'm afraid, or I'm resentful, or I'm worried, or I feel abandoned, or I'm disappointed. So what is the real thing? Because it's different for my partner to hear me say, I'm really disappointed that you haven't shown up for me in the way that I thought you had, or thought you would, versus you get on my nerves, and just angry, because that's what's easier to pour out. And so naming that emotion can really help navigate the situations better. And then just because I think it's important to say numb is a feeling. And I think sometimes being numb is a means of survival, right? Where there's just so many things coming, right? There's so many changes, there's so many emotional, you're trying to figure out what to do and find, the best care and navigate all that and be concerned about everybody else. And so sometimes as an active survival, our brains will kind of go numb. And so I want to just kind of validate that, like, there are people who feel all the things, and there's some people who are just like, I'm just going. I just got to keep moving. If I stop to feel too much, then I'm not sure what'll happen. And so although I don't encourage avoidance, I think we have to lean in and deal with our emotions. The reality is that when we're numb, that is an emotion. It's saying that we're overstimulated, right? Is that we can't take it in. And then most importantly, all feelings are valid. And I also want to let someone know I didn't start my timer, so I will need a time check in the chat for me, please. So because intimate relationships are part of relationships in our systems, I think it's really important to also talk about the nitty gritty, right? There are changes in sexual dynamics, what intimacy looks like, because if you add the physical changes, that impacts relationships. And so once again, if you haven't noticed, communication is key. There's some really great resources when we think about sexuality and intimacy to talk about whether it's other cores or different things that may be available to help to preserve that sexual intimacy. I love the 5 love languages. It is a great book. Part of one of the support groups we have at Texas Oncology that we're part of a study is where we've adapted the 5 love languages and added it to the cancer experience. Because a lot of times what happens is that in intimate relationships, our partner will think that they're loving us the best way that they can, right? And we don't necessarily feel it that way because maybe our needs have shifted. So if I'm physical touch and that's how I perceive love, but I'm always tired and I don't feel sexy or those kind of things, what happens to that dynamic? Do I feel the love that I need? And so how do I make the pivots necessary to feel that love? Or maybe I'm acts of service. And so also how I show my love is to serve, but also how I feel loved is to serve. But I also am dealing with not wanting to feel help, not accept help, and all those different dynamics. So it can really impact our intimate relationship and how I feel loved and supported, and ultimately my perception of my quality of life. So it's really important to think about, number one, how do I receive love? What does that look like for me? And then sometimes we don't know ourselves. So doing those quizzes like the 5 love languages assessments can really help us. But when we think about sexuality and intimacy, they're actually 2 different things, right? So sexuality is the act of sexual engagement, right? And all the different things that come with that and the pleasure that's related. But intimacy is the act of connection, right? Feeling seen, heard, and valued in a particular way. And so intimacy can be achieved even if sexuality and sexual physical connection isn't maintained, but that requires communication. And I also want to say that it is a medical issue. If your healthcare provider has not spoken to you about your challenges with sexuality, ask them. Okay. When it comes to intimacy, there are people like me who love to support individuals and families who are trying to navigate illnesses, but also preserve all things that are important to them. And so I believe intimacy is a quality of life issue. It's really important. And so we have to figure out how to preserve that, how to be really intentional about maintaining those connections. Okay. And then I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about the grief that comes with relationships and families, because we're often looking forward. And although I hate it when people say it, I'm going to say it. The pursuit of the normal doesn't exist. Like cancer comes in, it's a bomb, it blows things up. Like normal where? It's not there. And so we can grieve what we thought was coming. We can grieve life as we thought it would be, what we thought our season would look like at this age, or what we thought would be experiencing. And so as a result, sometimes there's detachment and there's even resentment and challenges in our family systems because they aren't sure how to navigate their own grief related to our illness, let alone us carrying our own. And then when we think about future plans, sometimes people, I'm seeing a beautiful young lady right now who is in survivorship, but is terrified to engage in an intimate relationship because she doesn't want to set them up for disappointment out of fear of reoccurrence and that reoccurrence anxiety. And so it'll really kind of impact how we navigate those relationships and dynamics if we don't really communicate and talk about them and try to process them. And when we're thinking ahead, it's really important to reevaluate and reprioritize. One of the biggest gifts that I have gotten in my life from serving those who are navigating serious illnesses is perspective. And one of my favorite quotes is that I hope that I have perspective without tragedy or trauma. And the reality is that when navigating, it's really it's helpful to reevaluate and reprioritize what's important to you. Are you grieving something that is no longer a priority? Because sometimes we'll get stuck in like kind of looking ahead and what should have been and what I thought it would be. And when the dust settles and we're processing, you're like, oh, I don't want to do that anymore anyway. That's really not important to me anyway. So it's really important to sit down and kind of step outside a little bit and reevaluate what's important. What are your priorities? What is now ahead? And then reprioritize those things. One of the things I want to do is I saw a lot of questions, so I'm going to make a little bit of a pivot if that's okay with everybody to make sure that I can kind of answer some of those. And then I'll kind of go back to some areas that I wanted to take a little bit of a deeper dive, if that's okay to you. So one of the questions that we got was that, how do you deal with your kids now treating you like you're the kid instead of the parent? And so role reversal is a real thing. I think when we think about navigating relationships, that role reversal happens often because there's the concern about your care and your needs. And so once again, I'm always going to say, start with communication. Okay, start with communication about, number one, how you feel about that. But also, I think if it sounds like you've probably raised these kids to be aware and be supportive. And so maybe there's a misinterpretation of what they're demonstrating and trying to do. So for example, if they're trying to show up for you in a way that what their care looks like, maybe expressing in a way that, I feel this when you do this. I'm so grateful that you guys care and you're concerned about me, but I feel this when you do this, or it's really important to me that I'm able to do this. And when you do this, it makes me feel this way. So you express the gratitude for their concern, but it's really important to be able to kind of call it out and say what it is. And I think when we think about our relationship, especially as I am the child of a parent who requires some assistance at some times, but she's completely independent, does everything. But if she were to be ill, one of the things that I know to be true is that we don't always know, we're not prepared to step into the role of caregiver. And so there could be some uncertainty and uncomfortability. So you want to make sure that that communication is there to reinforce that the relationship dynamic. And then also one of the things I was mentioning about as far as the support, when you ask for support and you don't get it, even if you've asked for it, the reality is that sometimes people can only love us, support us in the capacity of what they have. And so it's really important that, number one, if you conveyed your expectations and you really shared what you need and people still don't show up for you in that way, that you look for external support. I'm a realist, and I would love to say that people are going to always show up the way you have for them or give you what you deserve, but that's not always the case. So if that support doesn't show up the way you need it, there are great organizations like this one and the ones that are sponsoring tonight who can help you foster community and support. And cultivate relationships where it's necessary. One of the things that we actually have a support group at our practice, and over the ice storms that we had, two of our ladies who didn't have any family connected and were each other's support system from that bond that they created in that support group. And not saying it'll always happen like that, but you have to be willing to seek out. If the people who you love don't show up for you the way you need them to, it's okay to seek out. Because if not, you'll always expect for people to you'll be disappointed if you've conveyed and they just can't show up for you in that way. And the idea is that sometimes disappointment will happen because just as you are navigating this experience, the people who are navigating alongside you may need some support in figuring out what that looks like for them. And so the disappointment is real. Your humans have a human experience, and especially if it's a new one, people may not know how to do and how to be what you need them to be. So I can't say enough about communicating what that is that you need them to be and being very specific. I think it's just in general in relationships, oftentimes people will be like, well, you know me, you should know how to love me. I shouldn't have to tell you how to love me. I shouldn't have to tell you just common sense how to take care of me or what that looks like. But I would challenge and encourage everybody, don't make any assumptions that people get it. Sometimes that means saying, you know what, it would be really important for me is that when I'm talking to you, if you look at me and just give me your undivided attention, because that's something that's really important to me right now. Time is just really important. And so those are things that are simple, but sometimes it means just pulling back and explaining those things. Something else that's here is that, about the love languages. Just in general, part of what we did was we take the principles of the 5 love languages, and then we've created a curriculum for a study where we're basically modified all those perspectives for the cancer experience. So for example, when you are, where there's barriers in acting out some of those love languages, we've just kind of given some suggestions and application, and the group is for partners. And so the group breaks up into 2 different groups where the partners have a safe space to talk about their needs and challenges. And then those living with cancer also have the ability to do that as well. Go ahead, Tia.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Stephanie. You know, I was in the back room is what I like to call it, just saying to myself, gosh, I feel like I'm at church. She is just preaching to us, you know, good information that we truly, truly need, you know, and I just want to say thank you so much for dropping a lot of nuggets. We had a lot of questions. There was a lot going on in the chat, a lot of, you know, hands raised in and prayer hands and all kinds of things. So thank you. So let's jump right in. I want to bring our panelists on. I would like to welcome to the screen LaToya, Thomasina, and Mrs. Marilyn.
Hello, good evening. Good evening.
Hello, hello. I'm looking for the rest of our panelists. There we go. Okay, awesome. All right, so Stephanie, you know, clearly there's a lot that's going on during a time of a breast cancer diagnosis, and the conversation with our panelists is really going to help us with diving in. And for those who are still tuned in with us, you know, don't forget to put your questions in the Q&A. We want to try to get through as many as we can. I know Stephanie has taken the time to answer some of those. Well, with regards to our panelists, each of them have their own story and experience about how breast cancer diagnosis has impacted the relationships in their lives. So I want to take a moment for us to hear from each one of our panelists. And LaToya, I want to start with you. You know, you were diagnosed with early stage breast cancer in 2021. You're married, you have 3 children, 3 young, beautiful children, and you're still in treatment. Can you talk to us a little bit briefly about how it has impacted your diagnosis, has impacted your relationship, in particular with your husband?
Well, thank you again for having me. I appreciate Living Beyond Breast Cancer for having me here and wanting to have my insight as well. Having breast cancer and still being in active treatment in my 30s has been something I never imagined before. There's so many things that I identify with that Stephanie said, so many role reversals and not being able to, it's difficult for me to ask for help. I just don't ask for help. So that really resonated with me. And the trauma that my children experience with losing my hair, losing my breast, it is, you know, seeing me ill, you know, falling out. It's just been so many different layers to it, and having to care to their needs as well. Because when they were diagnosed, when I was diagnosed, they were ages 1, 4, and 6, and now they're just 3, 5, and 7. So they're still babies. Mm-hmm. And, you know, and now in addition to that, the hard thing is like watching your husband, you know, go through his emotions, and he's trying to be Superman and hide his feelings and crying in the shower. You secretly see him, you know, being frightened and seeing that in him. And you're trying to console yourself, but you're also trying to console your husband as well. And and more recently, what I'm experiencing this year, you know, after going through chemo and the bilateral mastectomy and radiation, is the body dysmorphia and how that affects me psychologically. I didn't know that for me, that has been like the role reversal in a body dysmorphia has been the most difficult thing for me with the cancer. It wasn't the chemo, you know, it's been the psychological aspects of this. Cancer is, in my opinion, is more of a psychological diagnosis than it is just physical. And so, you know, dealing with that, not wanting to look in the mirror, you know, after a mastectomy, because I had to stay flat because it was advised, because I had to go through radiation, and it was concerns about, you know, contractions with, you know, expanders and all that. So, you know, just that interim period before being flat to then having a reconstruction, and I'm still in that process, and just seeing your body, you're just not liking your body, not liking the way you look, and not wanting your husband to touch you, because you don't feel sexy, you don't feel beautiful, you don't feel glamorous. Like, it interferes with our intimacy. And I will say that I am very grateful for my husband. I'm not trying to like just put him on the pedestal, but I've heard so many like different stories and horror stories about women who going through this and their husbands divorced them, or not being supportive. And my husband has been my rock. Like, he tries to lift me up when I know I feel like I feel ugly. I don't look I don't, I don't look pretty. And, he's still like supportive or touching me. And, he literally had to tell me, like, why are you not letting me touch you? And that resonated. And I still push him away in instances. So it just affects so much. It affects so much. I can go on and on, so I don't want to take too much time, but from the other panelists, but it's been multi-layered. Yeah, for sure.
And this is a lot to unpack. And I think it doesn't matter whether you're married, you're single, you have a partner, we all, for the most part, have those experiences, and as we go through this journey, there are different components, whether it's losing your hair and, your nails turning colors, or whatever the case may be in terms of the side effects, and even post-treatment, we all are dealing with those same challenges. I remember my niece, when I lost my hair, and she was about 3 or 4 years old, and she told me I looked like Frankenstein. Of course I had to laugh, but, she did not like seeing me bald because it scared her. So I want to go to Thomasina. Thomasina, you've been living with metastatic breast cancer since 2005. And during this time, I would like to hear about, you in relationships, and how has it been, especially, from your first diagnosis, and then when you were diagnosed again, how was that different? If you can just share a little bit with us about that.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. I would say that the difference was of the first diagnosis and the second one is that I was so afraid. Like, in the beginning, I had no information about anything, didn't know what was going on. And then by the time it came the second time, I was like, kind of like, whatever. Like, as long as you come back, I'm going to keep fighting you. And I know that it's a possibility it can come back, but I'm not afraid. Like, if it does come back, I'm ready to do what I have to do. But as far as relationships, the role reversals did happen with my 2 daughters and my grandsons as well, whereas they had to be the caretaker pretty much, because the chemo was horrible, of course, like as everyone says. And I really needed them to help me, and it was hard for me to let them. And I was also still working. But then after 11 years, I had to leave my job. And it's difficult to watch them go through everything, and to see your I think my youngest one was 15 at the time. I didn't think I was going to see her graduate, and to see her thinking that her mom was going to pass away was, like, because she was with me the most, because she was still like home. And then my grandson didn't understand why I was sick, because they were young. And even the youngest one helped me with things to, put the blanket on me, whatever, but he didn't understand what's going on. And it's not easy, and it's very difficult. But I learned, I had like 1 diagnosis and 2 recurrences. So I'm kind of like, I'm not gonna say I'm used to it, but I know that it can always come back. So it's like, I'm just pretty much prepared. I hope it doesn't, but because I'm still living with it, but hope I don't have any more recurrences, but I'm pretty much used to that.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. And Thomasina, I'm sorry, Miss Marilyn, I want to talk to you about your diagnosis. You were diagnosed with breast cancer in 2021, while tragically still grieving the loss of your husband of 41 years to cancer, just a few years prior in 2019 to your diagnosis. Can you talk to us a little bit about what it was like for you? LaToya mentioned that her husband was her rock. What was that like for you, not having your rock there to lean on when you were going through your treatment?
Well, thank you, Tia, for this invitation. And Stephanie, you were talking to me personally. You just hit all of these hot points. For me, my breast cancer diagnosis was just a continuum of grief. I realized that I've been in grief for several years. And when my husband was diagnosed, it was sudden, it was quick, and I stayed numb. And that was my survival technique. And even after he transitioned and I retired and moved back home to Washington, I stayed numb, but yet I was continuing to operate. I find that my rock has been my children, my adult children. I am really blessed to have awesome children, my 2 sons and my daughter-in-law. They are the rock, and we rallied around each other. Once I was able to share that with them, we just did what we needed to do, and we continue to move forward. And on top of that, I didn't realize until Tia and I were talking that I was in like a triple dose of grief. My husband gone, this pandemic that was rocking the world, and everybody was living in pods and isolations, and then this cancer diagnosis. But I know that I was blessed because I had a doctor. I went back to the doctor I had before I moved away, before we moved to New York. My husband was a pastor, and then I moved back here, and I went back to my doctor, and my mother had breast cancer. So, and now I realize I have a sister who had breast cancer also. So when I got the letter from her saying, you know, it's time for your mammogram, and I said, well, I just had an MRI, really, you know, this thing can wait. Well, she said, no, you need to stay on point. And remember, this is the time when people were canceling appointments and basic procedures. So I went in, and it was the mammogram that really found it. There was no lump, nothing. It was just the mammogram that picked it up.
Thank you. And thank you for sharing. You know, it's really is interesting that you mentioned, you know, you had 2 sons that was helping you to navigate your breast cancer care and being your rock, as you called it. And then Miss Thomasina, you know, she had 2 daughters. So I'm sure there's, you know, were different perspectives. And then we look at LaToya, and she had little kids. You know, both of you all had adult children. So just thinking about just how that could, you know, potentially be different with those different individuals. And so Stephanie, I'd love to bring you in and kind of get a little bit of insight from you. When you heard Miss Marilyn talk, she mentioned about being numb. And that's how she was able to get through her breast cancer journey. Can you talk to us just a little bit about the impact of, at times, that being numb can have on us?
Yes,
and our relationships.
absolutely. So I think being numb, I think is probably more common than we think. Because so to some degree, people will say, well, it's avoidance, it's denial, or those kind of things. The reality is that if we look chemically, like there are really the mind can do things to protect us. And so in situations, especially like Miss Marilyn, where we're dealing with complex grief, because I would probably challenge some of those layers are probably deeper than we really know, because it shifts the whole dynamic and what support system. And so out of survival, sometimes we'll go numb to senses. Think about if you put your hand on a hot stove, right? When that heals, that initial healing, the surface, the next time you touch, there's a scab over it. So it's really not as hot each time because our body is helping to protect us from what's there the next time. And so in order for us to get back to that real layer of skin, that has to fall off. The same thing with our emotions and our mental well-being is that sometimes out of protection, our brain will do these coverings to try to keep us from our senses being so dull and so sensitive to the stimuli. And that's what happens when we're numb. And so sometimes that can be done intentionally, right? We think we're doing it intentionally, but we're probably not. But it's about what happens so that we don't stay there, because numbness can be very helpful. Not that it's something we want to do. We don't want to practice avoidance. I don't think that's healthy. But sometimes if our brain is helping to do that, sometimes that may mean it's what's necessary for us to survive and push through. But it's about what do we do once we acknowledge it, right? we want to be present. And sometimes that means the awareness of those difficult emotions can help us navigate and push through a little bit differently. But I think I heard a lot about like just even with having children and the impact in general of having those children present and that support from children. The impact on our parental relationship is really different when it comes to cancer, specifically because of what it means to explore the idea of mortality. And so for children, especially young children, one of the things that's really important is about that communication, because you want to be able to communicate with them in a way that's age appropriate, where they can digest that information. Because I see families all the time where they're like, well, we don't want the kids to know. No, they know. They don't know what it is. They know, they feel something, they're able to see it. And so that's why even in adult children, we see that role reversal, because part of what's there is that dynamic and trying to connect and feel that space and try to get that, soothe that, because there's a biological connection there that allows them to feel when you're uneasy, when there's the uncertainty. And so that's why we see that role reversal happen sometimes where they're like, I'm not your mom, I'm the mom. You don't tell me what to do. And that can happen. And sometimes it's just organic. And sometimes you see some personalities that lend themselves to it a little bit more. But that can really be a difficult space to be in if we don't call it out. And then also just about navigating the emotions. If we don't model what it looks like to hold our emotions and give it space, we teach our children that their emotions don't have space either.
Wow. Wow. So, speaking of the communication to our families, and dealing with those emotions, LaToya, how did you have that conversation with your children, if you don't mind sharing? I know we talked a lot about your husband, but how were you able to have that conversation with your kids and talk to them about mommy being diagnosed with breast cancer or being sick, or whatever way you presented it to your children?
To be honest, there wasn't a conversation because, like I said, I had just recently stopped breastfeeding my baby. So I had a 1-year-old, a 4-year-old, and a 6-year-old. They don't know what is cancer. Like, they don't know what that means. I mean, it was just, when I initially started going to chemo, and then like after that second treatment, my hair started falling off. It was like, that was just so traumatic for them. I mean, I just kind of told them, mommy is sick, but, I use the word cancer, but do they know what that means? No. So I used, I got 2 books. One was, they're actually 2 from 2 Black female authors, and specifically talking about breast cancer. And so we would read the books, and then one of the books had a coloring book in the end. And my daughter, my oldest, she likes to write, so I mean, I would just see little things that she would enter into her journal entry. But their like initial shock, their initial wake up call that mommy was sick is when, after my first treatment, and I came home and my husband gave me like those, those Neupogen injections that we all hate. And I passed out. And so the ambulance came to my house. And I ended up 2 days, in the hospital. So, I mean, I didn't, I wish they were a little bit older, sometimes, but they were babies. Like, they don't know what cancer means. So, I didn't have that conversation with them, to be honest. It was just, mommy's sick. And then and every time that I leave out the house, they're like, oh, mommy's going to the doctor. I can be going to the store even now, but if I leave the house, oh, mommy's going to the doctor. That's how much I was going to doctor's appointments or whatever. So they associate me leaving the home, going to the doctor. And so it's just difficult. I'm still dealing with the effects of that,
Yeah.
So.
And we actually had a question that came in the chat. Someone was interested in the books that you
Oh yeah, one of them is by Marquita Goodluck, and she also has her own radiation cream. You can Google it, Marquita Goodluck. I'll put it in the chat. And she sent me, she's a breastie I met. She sent me a radiation cream, and I did not burn, not one time during whole treatment, like a complete unicorn. So I'll put it in the chat. And the other one was I'll put it in the chat.
Awesome. And I was going to also say that Living Beyond Breast Cancer actually has a program, and we'll get that posted in the chat as well, where they actually have books for children to help you have the conversation with your children. And those books are at no cost. So be sure to tap into their program. Stephanie, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, I just was going to say that I think, LaToya, you said you didn't have a conversation, but you actually did. You said mommy's sick. right?
Yeah.
And so that's
Yeah.
an age appropriate way for them to understand what you're experiencing. And I think the other thing is just about being proactive in communication with the kiddos, for example, so that they don't have that fear. Because, for example, especially if they were there when you passed out and they had that experience, they may walk with that fear and not be able to communicate it because of their age. So if you call it out and say, hey, like, for example, when mommy leaves, mommy's going to ABC, so that they're aware that like, this means mommy's coming back, or this, to kind of walk through that with them. But I think I just wanted to acknowledge, like, you had a conversation. It may not have said that I have cancer, but really kind of calling and saying I'm sick in a way that they can understand, but what maybe they can expect. Maybe mommy might lose her hair, and sometimes mommy may feel really tired, but I still, in a way that they can understand.
Yeah, I wish I can go back and do that, like kind of prepare them, but I'll be honest with you, like I was still processing it myself.
Yeah.
Like, you go from being the role of the caregiver in the PA in the emergency room, taking care of patients, and then all of a sudden now you're the one who is being cared for. So the role reversal for me and just the processing of it, I worked up until the day before I started chemo with a port in the ER. Like it just wouldn't hit me. Like I was like, no, I was in denial for a long time. So
But you
yeah, I
also
would.
give yourself the grace that you did the best at what you knew to do with those circumstances for those babies.
Mhm.
And they got, what they needed in the time. And so there's time to kind of move forward, but you did the best that you knew to do.
Right. Yeah, you're right. And that's the reason why these conversations are important, so that if someone else is in my situation, then they can mentally prepare, their young children for, an age appropriate conversation.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And since you all were talking about role reversal, I want to just kind of pivot just a little bit. Stephanie actually talked a little bit about us wearing our cape. And when we think about Black women and who we are in our families and our position, many of us are familiar with the idea of being a strong Black woman. And Stephanie, if you can talk a little bit more about this dynamic and why it can actually be harmful to us as Black women and how it impacts the relationships.
Listen, if there's one thing I can't stand is that strong Black woman narrative and the superwoman narrative, because what it does is it's not created a space for us to model vulnerability. And so we oftentimes are in spaces where we are used to being the load bearer. And so we have the fear that if I put this load down, is there anyone that's capable of picking it up? And in turn, what that does is it doesn't allow the people around us the opportunity to even try. Because we're juggling, we're carrying it all. So then we kind of create a narrative where they can't show up for us if they wanted to, because we won't even give them the opportunity. But then also the idea of holding all of that emotional weight and the physical weight and strain isn't good for us. Like, let's just be honest. Like, it's not healthy. We deserve the grace. We deserve the safe spaces. We deserve the opportunity to be vulnerable and have our tears and feel all of our feelings, but also our joy and our hope. Like, we deserve all those spaces. But if we walk around like superheroes, the society, number one, isn't going to see us and create the space. So we have to carve it out for ourselves and say we deserve the privilege of being vulnerable. We have to kind of take that back, because it teaches people around us and even those who love us that we don't need that we don't need that space. And so they don't know. And so for me, I'm really committed to the generation behind me learning that, hey, sis, yes, you can carry the load and carry a lot, but that doesn't mean you have to. Yes, you can probably navigate it alone, doesn't mean you have to. The sisterhood, the friendship, the communities, like being able to, like, we are a people who thrive in community. And so why does that mean that we get to be in the community but not feel the support and the love of it? I don't think that makes sense to me. So it's really important for us to navigate and model vulnerability. There is power in our vulnerability, but we have to choose to lean into that.
Yeah.
And it's actually the healthiest thing for us.
Yeah. I remember seeing a TikTok and there was a young Black lady who just kind of went on a rant. I don't know if anyone else saw it, but she was like, I am vulnerable, coddle me. I'm, precious. I'm having, I'm not strong, like you say strong, right? When people say you're a strong Black woman, and she's like, strong is I have no other choice. It's the only thing that I can be. So I want to kind of ask Thomasina and Miss Marilyn, have you all had those experiences of being the strong woman, and what has that been like for you?
You want me to go first?
Yeah, Thomasina.
I've always been like that since I was young because I have 3 younger siblings that always took care of. So that was always in me to take care of everybody. And if I can't do it, then I think there's something wrong because I feel like there's nothing I can do. So when I was working, I would take one day off and then go to chemo the next day and then go back to work the next day. And I kept doing this for 11 years. And I don't even understand how I did that. But yeah, that's me being stubborn. I didn't want to accept, like I accepted some help, but I should have accepted more. But I think, telling myself that I'm okay, because once I feel like I can't work, go to work after I go to chemo, then something's wrong. So I constantly kept doing that to myself, and I made it out by the grace of God and my doctors and my family and myself. But yeah, so it's like I'm always I'm pretty stubborn when it comes to getting help and seeking help sometimes, but I've learned to stop doing that. So I'm hoping that a lot of people that needs the help would reach out to people, even if they feel like they don't want to, they should, because they probably need it and they probably think they don't.
Yeah. How about you, Miss Marilyn?
I think,
Does this resonate with you, being the strong Black woman?
well, my definition of being a strong Black woman is being in tune to yourself, and it is okay to cry. It's okay to be angry with God. It's okay to be angry with yourself and to express yourself. And that has always been so important to me, being straight up. This is how it is. And you don't have an option. You had to get up. You had to go to work. You had to continue to do laundry and pay bills. You had to do all of those things. And it is okay to get help and to say, I don't have it together. And that's where being numb came in for me.
Yeah. Thank you.
It worked for me.
Yeah. So I want to go ahead and answer some of the questions. I'm seeing the chat is just going on. The chat is truly, truly on fire. And same thing for the Q&A. So I want to just pivot to some of those questions that our audience has for us. We talk about this cape, right? And I have to go back to this cape, but oftentimes we wear our cape because we have so many disappointments. We get let down, and it hurts. And so it's our way of protecting ourselves. So how do we deal with these types of scenarios when we don't want to let our cape go because of the disappointment? And so Stephanie, if you could chime in on that one, that would be great.
Yeah, so I would love to say that people want people, right? And that people will show up for us in the way that they always will. We wish they would, but that's not reality. People can only love us at their capacity. And so I think how we navigate disappointment is how we navigate our expectations. I think we start out with, number one, verbalizing what we need from people and communicating, this is what I would like to see, and then giving them an opportunity to show up and do that exact thing that we've asked them to do. If we haven't communicated it, being okay with saying, hey, what I meant was this. And then if people fail to do that, be okay with the reality that, yes, it will hurt. Yes, it could be painful and disappointing, but that people can only show up for us in their capacity. And if they don't do that, that doesn't mean that you don't deserve that thing. It just means that they don't have the capacity to give it to you. But that also means you have to find somewhere else. And so I love the idea of fostering community, fostering support. Yes, you deserve the love and dedication and support from the people that belong to you, right? That should intrinsically give that to you. But if they can't, that doesn't mean you don't get it. That means seek out, look for opportunities, look for community. I heard a beautiful story when we were logging in of people showing up for each other and being at the bedside of each other. And so those people didn't sound like they were related. Those are friends and relationships that were cultivated in different communities. I've also done stuff with Survivor, where they literally foster a partner. And so if the people you wish could show up for you don't take that on as you don't deserve it and just neglect yourself because they can't do it. Now you're harming yourself just as much as they did. Make sure you seek out those opportunities.
Yeah. And so that leads me to the next question. How do we go about juggling, taking care of ourselves, our children, our parents, especially when we're in this, what we call the sandwich generation, right? So I want to ask that to, I'll ask LaToya, because LaToya, that you're the younger one on the panel. How do you navigate all of that? Especially when you have young kids, and then I'll ask Ms. Marilyn and Thomasina the same thing as well. But LaToya, how do you navigate trying to manage everything? and including yourself?
I don't know how I became. I don't know. I mean, it's definitely God's grace, that I've been able to manage, still being a mom to very young children who, can't do anything for themselves. I have to, we still have to bathe them, we still have to brush their teeth, still have to prepare their meals, pick out their school clothes. So it's by God's grace, and just, I guess, really, they give me my strength. They give me a reason to live and to push through. And and just that resilience, I think it just taps in as being a natural woman and a natural mother. It is what pushes me through, and just knowing that. The other thing too for me is that, for a while I also felt guilty because they weren't able to enjoy their normal activities, like they normally were. Like, I had to pull them from school and daycare because I was, just scared of getting sick because of in the thick of chemo, and pulling them from their other, activities that they were in. And so, but now I'm in a better place, even though I'm still in treatment. And so I just don't want their childhood to be further impacted by this cancer. Like, I'm not going to continue to allow breast cancer to rob them of their childhood from the trauma that they're already still trying to work through and recover through.
Yeah.
So.
Thank you. And Thomasina, I'm going to ask you that question, but I want to ask it in a different kind of way, because you do have adult children, and you've actually, been dealing with this, like I said, since 2005. So there's been a different transition. But how do you navigate a relationship with your adult children and a diagnosis, especially when you have, some of, you may have one or two that are in their early adult ages, like 21, 22, and they start to pull away. They create distance between you and them after being diagnosed with breast cancer. How do you deal with that?
I think when you start realizing that they're pulling away from you, I just try talking to them a lot. And like, if I'm thinking something is a certain way, instead of assuming it, I ask them, and I realize it's not what I think it is. And I keep them informed that I appreciate them and love them for helping me, but there's a lot of things that I can do to let me do whatever it is I could do on my own, as much as I can do it. And when I need their help, I'll let them know, pretty much. And I guess they're just afraid that something's gonna happen to me. So now, since it's been so long, it's a little better. Like, sometimes they kind of forget me in a way, but it's like, but it's better now since I've been dealing with this since, like, I think it's like 17 years already. And I'm still living with it. So thank God for that. And I just, reach out, and we talk a lot, all of us, my daughters and my grandsons. We talk a lot about things that we think the other person is feeling, so we can make sure we know what it is. Because majority of the time it's something different than what you think. Yeah. So I talk to them a lot. I conversate a lot.
And that's a great point. And I want to just say thank you for sharing that with us. Stephanie talked about communication and sharing your emotions and being vulnerable and transparent. And I think that's important for us to be able to communicate. And so, Stephanie, I want to ask you, can you give us some language to help our family members, help us to have this conversation, and help us to help them process what we're dealing with and what we're going through, kind of our circumstances, especially when they don't see illness, right? They don't see our hair gone. They don't see the challenge in our nails. They don't see us walking with a cane or anything of that nature. They just see, oh, you're fine, kind of like what Thomasina said. Sometimes her children even forget. So can you give us some language to help us to be able to have that conversation so that they can process what we're actually dealing with?
Yeah. So the first thing I think where it's really important to start is ask them what they know. Tell me what you understand about what I'm going through and about my illness. I want to make sure that I can, answer any questions you have, but most importantly, I want to know what you know. And I think that's a really great place to start, because it levels the playing field. I say the same thing to my clinicians and my physicians. I tell them, when you want to know where a patient is, ask them what they understand. What do they know to be true? Mm-hmm. And I think that's where you start, because then you can fill in any gaps and say, well, actually, and I know it looks like mama's doing whatever, and I am doing well. I'm grateful I'm doing as well as I am. But here's what I need you to know about what's going on with my body and my health. But also, here's what I need from you. right? And explaining those things. And sometimes people don't know. They think that they're giving you the break or they're giving you the space. Because I saw somebody in there about preserving your energy, because you do also have to preserve your energy and your space and navigate and set your boundaries. And so sometimes people think they're giving you what you need. And so I think it's really important to ask the questions that are important. And then use, just like if we were in relationship counseling, it's just like the TV shows make it. I feel this when you do this, or when you didn't do this, this made me feel this way. So you kind of take the ownership of that to say it onto yourself and make it really about like what that dynamic is. And then say, I don't want to misinterpret. You know, sometimes I want to make sure I understand. Right now, it feels like you aren't as worried about me, or I don't feel as close to you, or I feel like we're disconnecting. But I know that maybe isn't true. So I want to make sure we stay tight. So can we talk a little bit about what's going on? I believe in transparency. But I also believe that we have to make space for people to have an emotional response to our transparency. So you can't tell me you feel like I haven't been there for you and then be upset that I'm upset that you upset. We have to make space for both emotions, for yours and theirs. And also, I think Ms. Thomasina said a really great point, that also about the misunderstandings that can occur, making sure that we ask for clarification before we say, well, you're not showing up for me. Well, maybe they also have their own stuff and don't know how to. Or maybe they're navigating their own fear. So they're trying to figure out what to do with that and don't want to bring you down because they don't want to ask you every day, well, are you all right? What the doctor say? What's happening? So they don't know what to do. And so I think a lot of that can happen with really just small communication. What do you know? This hurt me. I felt this way. I'm sure it wasn't your intentions, but this is what I perceive from that. Can you help me better understand? And so start with maybe identifying how you feel, then what their behavior actually did to you.
Awesome, thank you. That was great insight. So I want to ask this question. I think a lot of times when we're dealing with other people, and right now, especially with COVID and just everybody's going through something this day and time. And so sometimes we have situations where people compare their scenarios or their health crisis or their life crisis towards us. And it really can be, a hard pill to swallow, or it can hurt us when someone makes a comparison around, whatever they have going on. How do we deal with that when we say, you can't even compare, right? What you're going through in cancer. How do we really have those conversations with them to let them know that they've hurt us, for one, and really want them to understand that we truly, truly need them. We need their support, we need their help, but we don't want them to compare us because what we're going through is a tragedy for us. They may be going through a tragedy for themselves, but this is our tragedy, and we don't want the comparison. So can you talk to us a little bit about that, Stephanie? How do we manage or navigate that with other people?
I think that's a tough one. It's a tough one because sometimes people will try to share as a connection point, not necessarily to negate what your experience is, but to kind of relate. So it's tough because oftentimes we're not trained or equipped to communicate in a way to just let you have your space and let you share. So the first thing I'm going to encourage people to give people grace and extend yourself the same. But the other thing is that be okay with saying, you know what, today I'm all full up. Today, I only have the emotional capacity for my stuff. And although I love you and care for you, I really don't have the space to hear this. So what I need from you is a listening ear. Or, for example, today, give the permission to not talk about cancer. If you just want to hang out and not talk about it, then say, hey, today, I want to focus on this. I just want to focus on getting my nails done. I won't do anything else. We're not going to talk about cancer today. I want a break. I live it every day. I don't need you to talk about it for me today to do. But also people don't know what to say. Sometimes people say dumb stuff. I know y'all probably know, but people say dumb stuff and they're really trying to be supportive. They really aren't aware. They just want to be there. And sometimes when we're uncomfortable, we just say words. And so it's important to be okay with saying, you know what, I appreciate you trying to show up for me and be supportive. But what I really need from you is this. Or sometimes, can I just have this space today? I really just need to talk and vent. And stop them. Have no problem stopping them and saying, I just can't take this today. I love you, child, but no, not today. But call me and I'll call you when I have some space because I really want to be there for you when I can, but today I don't have it. And that also models them models for them that self-care for themselves as well.
Yeah.
And if they don't respect that boundary, then that's a whole nother conversation.
Yeah. And Miss Marilyn, you know, you have two sons, adult sons, who had to deal with that grief alongside you of losing their father. And then a few years later, the pandemic hits and then their mother gets diagnosed with breast cancer. How did you have conversations with your children, your sons, your adult sons? How were you able to communicate to them?
Well, first of all, I did not, I'm blessed to have my daughter-in-law is awesome. She went with me. She took me to get the biopsy, and we didn't tell where we were. We just went out that morning, and I had the biopsy, and then we went to breakfast in the car at Starbucks, because remember, nobody went anywhere inside during the pandemic, that phase of the pandemic. And once I got the confirmation that it was cancer, I had to tell them, my sons, at the same time, and that's the mother in me. So I said, you all come on over, and I told them. And once I set it up and said, you know, this is what's going on, and I have to have this, and this, they took the moments of relief, and then they went right into this pragmatic moments of, okay, what do we have to do? What are the dates? Surgery, we have to drive. Both of them drove me to the to surgery that morning. And I think one or both of them spent the night here, or they asked, do you need to come to our house? And I said, no, I'm staying in my house. And then we just went on a road, because we had just gone through this with their father. So it was very much to the point, and hoping for a better outcome than what we've had with their dad.
Thank you. Well, before we wrap up, Stephanie, I have one question for you, one final question from our audience. What do you do when your family doesn't agree with your decisions regarding your treatment, whether it's, you know, going the conventional route or not going the conventional route? How do you navigate that when your family is not in agreement with your decisions?
Yeah, so I think that's a tough one. I think the first thing is that kind of the awareness that sometimes people act out their love in bad behavior. Like, think about a kid, right? Sometimes when they don't know how to process what to do, they have bad behavior. And so sometimes our family in love and just concern and compassion will act out because they just don't get it. They can't process it. And so maybe a little bit of grace there, but most importantly, it's your life. And so I think one of the most important things is that you only get one go at this. And so it is important to advocate for yourself, to speak up and step in the boldness of your voice. And that means with your healthcare providers, that means with your family, to speak up and choose to live on your terms. And sometimes when there's a lack of control in a lot of different areas, assume all of it where you can. And so that means that people, when they truly love you, they may not understand it, but they may stand beside you. And so you have to set that boundary to say, hey, I've made this choice and you may not get it and you may not understand, but if you're going to choose to be here, here's what I need you to do. And if you're not going to be on board, you can't be here. You got to love me from a distance. Send me a plate, send me whatever, but you can't be in my space if you're not going to show up in the manner that I need you to. And so that's okay to say that. And I think sometimes we don't give ourselves the permission to advocate for ourselves as intensely as we probably should. And so that doesn't mean you're also acting out. It's saying, hey, here are the parameters. I'm choosing to do A, B, and C. And if you love me and I want you here and walk beside me, then you need to be a cheerleader for A, B, and C. If you can't do A, B, and C, I want you to love me from over there and I'm gonna love you from over here. It doesn't change that dynamic. But what I need is for this. And be okay with how the chips fall. And I think that's the tough part, right? Because I think naturally we kind of know, like, to tell people, like, get right or go home. But it's what happens when the chips fall. And maybe people do choose to not show up for us the way we do when we're dealing with that disappointment. And so I think that's where we have to prepare ourselves once again about, and that goes back to expectations. People can only love us at our capacity. But also, if people are having trouble processing, offer them some support. There are therapists like me who specialize in this, that support caregivers and families who are also trying to process, right? So there are a lot of their caregiver support groups, their family support groups, where you're like, if you don't understand today, that's okay. I need to protect my space, but go get you some help so that you can then be a help to me.
Awesome. Thank you so much to our entire panel and all of you for such a rich conversation.